top stories tonight. Foreign nationals continue evacuating from Kabul as Western nations agree to resettle more Afghan refugees. Another record day of coronavirus infections for New South Wales as the outbreak in New Zealand continues to grow with 10 new cases today. And up to 200 Australians return home after a repatriation flight from Bali touches down in Darwin. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. Also tonight, what is behind China's latest crackdown, this time on its own tech giants? Well, as Taliban leaders return from exile and its control over the governance of Afghanistan extends, former coalition allies have their focus firmly on repatriating their citizens and offering refuge to those Afghans who help them. Australia has agreed to resettle 3,000 this financial year, while the UK will grant visas to 20,000 Afghan refugees, with women, girls and minorities to be given priority. These issues were being addressed by the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson a short time ago during an emergency session in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I think it would be fair to say that the events in Afghanistan have unfolded and the collapse has been faster than I think even the Taliban themselves predicted. What is not true is to say that the UK government was unprepared or did not foresee this, because it was certainly part of our planning of pitting the very difficult logistical operation for the withdrawal of UK nationals has been under preparation for many months, Mr. Speaker. We will be supporting, doing everything we can to support those who have helped the UK mission in Afghanistan and investing everything that we can to support the wider area around Afghanistan and to do everything we can to avert a humanitarian crisis.
And we'll get more on the British government's response to the situation in Afghanistan with our London correspondent Nick Dole a little later in the program. Meantime, the first Australian rescue flight from Afghanistan has touched down in Dubai with 26 people on board. The Prime Minister is promising it'll be the first of many, with the federal government hoping to evacuate hundreds more, despite the dangerous and volatile security situation in the country. There are fears many Australians outside of Kabul may not manage to reach the capital and will be left behind. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Rescue from Kabul. A midnight mission managed in darkness. A handful of Australians on their way home and Afghan families with a future more certain.
We will bring out as many as we can, as safely and as quickly as we can.
The Australian Air Force Hercules C-130 left a Dubai airbase about 11 p.m. Canberra time. Steering well clear of Iranian airspace, it then flew north over Pakistan, dropping off radar, continuing on to Kabul. Once on the tarmac, 26 people were taken on board. The lucky few had been able to navigate Taliban checkpoints and queues of traffic into the airport.
Outside the airport, at one point people were having to be lifted over gates.
The plane reappeared on the radar over Kandahar, landing in Dubai mid-morning Canberra time.
This was the first of what will be many flights.
A giant Globemaster aircraft will be flown in next. The government hopeful it can match allies' evacuation efforts.
It's very difficult for any Australian to imagine the sense of chaos and uncertainty that is existing right across this country.
Once in Dubai, evacuees are given health, ID and biometric screening before being quickly flown to Australia. The return of the Taliban is already sparking fears of a humanitarian crisis. Australia's promising to accept more than 3,000 Afghan refugees this financial year, but not if they come by boat, as many thousands did a decade ago.
I want to send a very clear message to people smugglers in the region that nothing's changed. I will not give you a product to sell and take advantage of people's misery.
A heartless announcement from the Prime Minister and goes nowhere near enough for what Australia should be doing.
Once the evacuation mission is over, Australia and its allies will have to decide whether to recognise the Taliban as Afghanistan's government. No one believes the Islamist group has really changed its character or reformed its views on women and human rights more broadly. But if the Taliban once again allows Afghanistan to be a base for global terrorism, we might be back there soon enough. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, the former Prime Minister John Howard has hit back at suggestions Australia hasn't done enough to evacuate people from Afghanistan, saying the situation in the country is still unfolding. Speaking to 7:30, Mr Howard criticised the withdrawal of US troops as too hasty.
The government right at the moment, as you heard from the Prime Minister today, is involved in an airlift operation. It's difficult because there's no doubt that the collapse of the opposition to the Taliban has been very rapid. I've got some views about how that should never have been allowed to occur. I think the Americans were too hasty in winding down to zero their military involvement in Afghanistan. I think it could have been possible to have had a more orderly withdrawal, but we had to deal, obviously, with the situation that we faced. And I think it is quite unfair on the government to suggest that we haven't even bothered to help any of the people that helped us.
Survivors of the earthquake that killed nearly 2,000 people in Haiti have been forced to take cover in makeshift shelters as a tropical storm lashed the Caribbean nation. Saturday's quake knocked down tens of thousands of buildings in the poorest country in the Americas. The situation has now been made worse by flash flooding and landslides in the wake of Tropical Storm Grace. At a tent city on Lake Cay, people scrambled to repair flimsy roofs while waiting for government aid to arrive. The United Nations says it's allocated $11 million in emergency relief funds. 4 Hong Kong university students have been arrested on accusations of advocating terrorism after they paid tribute to an attacker who stabbed a police officer and then killed himself. Authorities say the man who stabbed the officer had material in his home decrying the controversial national security law, as well as notes where he declared his hatred for the police. The arrests are the latest use of the legislation which Beijing has imposed on the territory. Among those detained are the president and council chair of the university's student union. The New South Wales Premier has issued an impassioned plea for people to follow stay-at-home orders. It seems almost every day sees yet another record number of cases. Today, the number was 633. Another 3 people have died. Here's Ashley Raper.
From a state that set the standard to a state of despair.
Unfortunately, we had a huge increase in the number of cases.
The numbers jumped from the 400s to 633.
Out of the 633 cases, 550 are still from southwestern and western Sydney.
Every person is passing on the virus to more than one person, so we are continuing to see case numbers increase.
The death toll too has increased. 2 men in their 70s died at Nepean Hospital, while another in his 60s died at Liverpool.
We will see more admissions and more deaths if these numbers continue to increase.
Premier, what's it going to take here? Is it going to take 1,000 cases a day, 1,200 cases a day before you institute a proper stage 4 lockdown?
We rely on the advice of our health experts. We know that our lockdown is extremely harsh. We have had and continue to have the right settings in place, but unfortunately too many people continue to do the wrong thing.
Those giving the advice are leaving the door open for harsher rules.
We have ongoing discussions about what more can we do.
Have you suggested a harsher lockdown is needed and that advice has been ignored? It's a yes-no answer.
It's not as easy as that. What we do is define the problems. So we define the fact, the settings that transmission's occurring, the fact that we need to decrease mobility.
And then it's up to the Premier and the small group of ministers in crisis cabinet to decide what to do. What's unclear is how much of the health advice is followed and how much is ignored.
We believe it's incumbent upon the government to release the health advice. Let all of us understand the circumstances by which decisions are being made by the New South Wales Government.
Is it now time for you to stop promising that some restrictions will ease next month?
Well, no, I think that the challenge for us is to make sure that whilst we're asking people to adhere to the strict rules, that we're also asking them to come forward and get vaccinated.
The surge in cases is incentive enough for some.
Well, with the cases today, yeah, we're very happy we've been able to come here and get vaccinated.
It's a really scary number to think that even last week when we were at 200, we were concerned about it, and now it just seems like it's getting out of hand.
Companies continue to take matters into their own hands. The Commonwealth Bank has started rapid antigen testing of their workers in hotspot areas. Ashley Raper, ABC News, Sydney.
The COVID situation in the ACT is changing rapidly. The Territory recorded 22 new cases in the past 24 hours, bringing its outbreak to 67 infections. 190 exposure sites have been identified, including 7 schools. Shadow Finance Minister Katie Gallagher's teenage daughter caught the virus during a school drama class. The Senator says young people have been let down by Australia's vaccination rollout.
My little girl's, lying in bed on her own with terrible symptoms, and I can't do anything about it. And my son's in the next room waiting to catch it. And that, I know, as a parent, it's really difficult.
The median age of those infected with COVID in the capital is 19. And New Zealand reported 10 cases today, one day into a snap 3-day lockdown prompted by its first case in months. The countrywide restrictions were brought in to try and stifle the potential spread of the Delta variant, and the origins of the case have been traced back to Australia.
Life in lockdown. New Zealanders had almost forgotten what it was like, living largely restriction-free for the past 6 months. But just one case of COVID-19 in Auckland was enough to plunge the entire country back into lockdown, and the culprit was soon revealed.
The results that have come back from our case yesterday tell us 2 things. First, that we are dealing with the Delta variant. The second thing it tells us is that it has linked the current genome sequencing of cases in the New South Wales outbreak. Our case has originated in Australia.
Nationwide, a strict level 4 lockdown will apply for 3 days, while Auckland will endure a whole week. How the infection reached New Zealand's shores is still unclear. But it's another blow to the country's early success in fighting the virus, praised for shutting down hard and fast. Adding to its woes a slow pace of vaccination, particularly among Maori and Pacific peoples. Case numbers are already creeping upwards, and there are warnings they could reach 100.
There are now a further 2 cases of COVID-19 to report in the community, all of whom are in the process of being transferred safely to the Auckland quarantine facility under strict infection prevention control procedures.
I think from the experience of what we've seen overseas, we are absolutely anticipating more cases.
Trying not to panic at an all too familiar situation. Andrea Neerhoff, ABC News.
Well, let's go back to Afghanistan, and Australia has completed its first rescue mission out of the country. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says the situation on the ground is volatile, but he does expect it'll be the first of many flights in coming days. Our Foreign Affairs reporter, Stephen Jedget, says only 26 people were on board this flight because of several obstacles, both diplomatic and physical.
That's right. Well, what we're hearing from people on the ground is that it's very, very difficult to actually get to the airport in order to get on one of these evacuation flights. So, of course, we saw the first evacuation flight leaving Kabul for the Middle East, organised by the Australian government. It left in the early hours of this morning, but there were only 26 people on board. And it seems that one of the reasons, aside from the fact that it was a somewhat smaller plane used by the government, but one of the reasons so few people were taken out was that at least some couldn't get to the tarmac and into the terminal to get on the flight. Now, the reasons, well, there are many. The first is that there are multiple levels of security to actually get into the airport, not only the police, but also the Taliban. And at the final level, the US military have all set up checkpoints, security checkpoints, to stop people from going in, or at the very least to check their paperwork. And many people said that even when they showed their Australian passports, the Taliban simply wouldn't let them through. In one instance, when they came through with their Australian passport, they said the US military wouldn't let them through. So there's obviously a lot of confusion about that. On top of that, there's just a broader chaos and violence of Kabul at the moment, particularly around the airport, where there are apparently thousands of people milling about at various times, all trying to get in. That uncertainty, that tension, that general chaos has occasionally exploded into violence. In some instances, we've been sent videos of soldiers firing into the air, in one instance into a crowd. And that chaos and violence has basically made it impossible for some people to get through. We spoke to one Afghan Australian who had two relatives, both female, who were trying to get through. The moment they ran into that violence, they simply felt that they had to flee, so they couldn't get on the plane. So this all speaks to the difficult situation on the ground, the enormous security challenges and logistical challenges that Australian Army officials and civilian officials have to grapple with as they try and get this evacuation program off the ground.
So, Stephen, what does it then mean for people that worked with our forces who had been promised a way out, some form of protection? What chances have they got of leaving?
Well, they do have some chances of getting through. We know that some got through in the first flight that took off with only 26 people on board. Some of those, we don't know how many, were locally engaged Afghan staff. So they clearly managed to get through the various checkpoints with the documentation that they had, got to the plane and got out of the country. So it's certainly not impossible, just difficult. But we are hearing from some Afghan interpreters who worked for the Australian Army back when we were fighting in Afghanistan. And some of them say that they not only feel like they have no chance of getting through the blockades that have been put up by the Taliban. They're fearful that if they were to approach the Taliban and they discovered they worked for Australia, that they'd essentially be arrested on sight. But they're also anxious about the fact that they've had, in some cases, little or no communication from the Australian government. One interpreter we spoke to today said he'd had absolutely no communication. He'd put in multiple emails and phone calls to the Australian government and had heard nothing back. Now, that's not a universal experience. We do know that some Afghan locally engaged staff have been closely engaging with the Australian government, have been, in close communication and feel like they're confident they will get on a flight. But in some cases, some people feel like not only do they have little to no chance of getting through, but also they've got no clear guidance from the Australian government about what they need to do or whether they're even entitled to get on the plane. So there is enormous uncertainty in Kabul. It's not universal. It's not across all people who've worked for the Australian government, but amongst some cohorts, there's great uncertainty and fear about the future.
Other countries that were part of the coalition that were stationed in Afghanistan and fought in Afghanistan have talked about upping their refugee intakes. What is Australia saying they're going to do?
So Australia made a commitment today that it would basically guarantee 3,000 places within the existing humanitarian refugee program for Afghan nationals. Now, that's something that's been welcomed cautiously by many refugee groups. They say that that's a good start, but they also argue that it doesn't go nearly far enough. They point out that other countries, including the UK and Canada, have made more generous commitments, in both cases 20,000 refugee places being made available for Afghan refugees. And the argument from refugee groups is that that's the sort of commitment you need to see, given the fact that the Taliban have now seized power and given the enormous anxieties in that country about what that will mean for the rights of women and minorities as well as children in that country. So the government has made a commitment to do this, but the broad argument from advocates is that it isn't nearly enough. The other question, of course, is what happens with the broader attempt to evacuate people in the near term. And The government is telling us that it's going to ramp up these flights quite substantially. The flight that went in today was a relatively medium or small-sized transport plane. The next planes that are coming in, we're told, are going to be larger ones that are capable of taking many more people. And hopefully, particularly if those issues around the security of the perimeter are resolved, hopefully far more people can come through. But it's not just contingent on the Taliban and the police and the negotiations with the US military. It's also contingent upon the weather. And some poor weather is due to hit Kabul at the end of the week. That could further complicate things for the officials who are trying to get many more people out of Afghanistan and back to the relative safety of the Middle East and then to Australia.
Stephen, good to talk to you. Thank you so much. A massive bushfire that's consumed a large swathe of forest west of Jerusalem has been brought under control. It comes after a 3-day battle that required more than 100 firefighting teams across Israel and over a dozen firefighting planes. The fire burned over 20 square kilometres, forcing hundreds of families to flee their homes in several communities just outside Jerusalem. Police in Thailand have used water cannon to break up a demonstration at the National Police headquarters. Protesters gathered in central Bangkok for a third successive day to demand the Prime Minister resign over his handling of the pandemic. Demonstrations have been gaining momentum, with Thailand on track to pass 1 million cases this week. A man who attended a protest on Monday is in hospital in a coma with a gunshot wound to his neck. Police deny using live ammunition to disperse demonstrators. A senior UK diplomat says the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar is getting worse each day as the third wave of COVID ravages the country. The British Deputy Ambassador to the UN points out that prior to the coup, Myanmar had a strong vaccination record and was developing a COVID-19 plan.
Now, Myanmar's health system is barely functioning. Unacceptable attacks on hospitals, doctors and nurses continue, and only 3% of the population are vaccinated.
He has called for an immediate and sustained humanitarian pause to allow vaccines to get into all in need in Myanmar. In Victoria, a random mix of COVID cases around the Bayside suburb of St Kilda have contact tracers hard at work tonight. Worryingly, some of the mystery infections are in vulnerable and homeless communities, and there are fresh concerns about whether the system is coping with the ballooning mental health problems in this 6th lockdown. Here's state political reporter Richard Wellingham.
Melbourne's famed Fitzroy Street has authorities worried. It's right in the heart of the inner south, where 15 COVID cases have emerged without a common link.
We have accountants, we have architects, we have a sex worker, we have members of the Orthodox Jewish community, and we have a pizza guy who works in a pizza shop in Glen Ira. It is a very broad and disparate range of people.
The sex worker lives in a rooming house, and a homeless person has also been infected. Services for the vulnerable, including the Salvation Army, have become exposure sites. New testing and vaccination hubs have been quickly set up in response. More cases have been linked to these public housing towers on Lygon Street, and there's concern about slowing testing rates. So much so, the government's released a new ad campaign to fight complacency.
Can you tell the difference between a runny nose and COVID?
It's not just the testing regime that's under pressure. Successive lockdowns have caused a shadow pandemic, with a wave of mental illness flooding hospitals and GPs. And it's putting pressure on doctors, their weary staff and patients.
We're seeing new people who've never had to present for mental health reasons before, in crisis, having breakdowns, suicidal.
Making matters worse, senior psychiatrists say the workforce is broken, with some staff making more money working at hotel quarantine.
If the government can allow sports stars and movie stars in here, they can find a way to get mental health skilled clinicians in here, because we do not have enough. The mental health clinicians that are on the ground are burning out and exhausted.
We see no plan on how we can build a workforce, and we see no plan about how we can provide that level of hope that people desperately need to get their lives back on track.
GPs are also reporting a spike in people presenting for the first time, and many are worried about children.
What we're seeing is an appointment book of open wounds. You see the list of names of the people that you're going to see that day, and you realise that they're really struggling.
The government is spending billions of dollars to fix the mental health system, But can it be done any faster, given the dire need?
We are fast-tracking that, but there is always more to do. What we have seen is a system that was under stress and already broken further have to look at how it delivers support.
And the toll of these latest restrictions appears to be extending to the thin blue line, with some officers struggling with the burden of enforcement.
Behind every uniform there's a human being, there's a person often that has kids at home too. It's difficult work, it can be draining and depressing work as well.
Evidence that nearly every facet of our society is doing it tough. Richard Willingham, ABC News, Melbourne.
Around 200 Australians have landed in Darwin on a government-assisted repatriation flight from Bali. They left the island as COVID infections there continue to climb. Today, 66 new deaths were recorded. Reporter Kate Ashton says the new arrivals will spend the next 2 weeks in isolation at the Howard Springs quarantine facility.
Well, look, Bev, it's notoriously tricky to get numbers of these flights. There are pretty strict rules about people having to get a negative COVID test before they fly. We've heard just recently from a Balinese official that they thought that there was about 186 people on the flight. Before that, we'd heard about 200. So whether that means, a number of people weren't able to get on the plane at the last minute. What we do know is from here, they'll be disembarking at Darwin Airport before they spend 2 weeks in quarantine at the Howard Springs facility.
So how does that compare, Kate, to the number of Australians who are stuck in Bali trying to get home?
Again, Bev, it's a number that's sort of difficult to ascertain exactly. We've heard in the past month numbers around 600 or 700 Australians stuck in Indonesia. For this flight, we heard that the government was prioritising vulnerable Australians. Again, what exactly counts as vulnerable is up to interpretation. Today, we heard from a couple of Australians who are still stuck in Bali who thought, their situation of being in a place with an increasing amount of COVID there were 66 deaths in Bali today, counts as being vulnerable. And what we haven't heard as well from the government is if there will be more repatriation flights from Bali and from Indonesia. At this stage, this is the only one planned into Darwin for August that we know of.
Yeah, and of course, Howard Springs has been such a sort of gold standard for quarantine around the country. But given the current COVID situation in Darwin, is there nervousness around quarantining people?
Well, I actually put that to NT health authorities today because now, given we've had this one positive case in Darwin, we are in fact in lockdown in Greater Darwin and Katherine at the moment. Not only are there international and domestic arrivals in Howard Springs, there's also more than 35 close contacts of that man in his 30s who tested positive to COVID-19 in Katherine on Monday. But NT health authorities say there's still plenty of capacity at that facility. So right now there's over 1,600 people there. That includes those close contacts, it includes domestic travellers from hotspots like Sydney or Melbourne, and of course international arrivals. So this plane load from Bali will join them at the Howard Springs facility, and there's many more to come. There's 9 more flights scheduled for August from different places around the world, London, New Delhi, and also a flight of seasonal workers expected to quarantine at Howard Springs. We had actually heard from the Federal Health Minister earlier this month that he thought Howard Springs would hit capacity in August. So that's what we're inching towards potentially later this month.
Great to talk. Thanks, Kate. Well, Qantas is the latest employer to announce mandatory vaccinations for its workers. Unions warn the decision could backfire. The airline has already said that its international passengers will need to be vaccinated. A decision on domestic travel is yet to be made.
Like most of us, Qantas can't wait to get back to business, and the company's now forcing its staff to get vaccinated against COVID-19.
We have an obligation of duty of care for our customers and employees to make the workplace as safe as possible.
Qantas wants frontline workers, including cabin crew and pilots, fully vaccinated by November. The aim is to have all 22,000 staff immunised by March, and the airline hopes that its catering suppliers and other partners follow its lead.
If other employees decided that they're not taking the jab, then they are deciding, I think, that aviation isn't the area for them.
It's a decision that the Prime Minister's on board with.
They have a reasonable position to be able to make this request, and they've gone about it, I think, in a very engaged way.
For now, passengers on domestic flights won't be forced by the airline to get vaccinated, but it will be a requirement for those flying overseas.
don't believe it should be forced upon anyone.
If you can get vaccinated, you should get vaccinated.
Unions want Qantas to meet with its staff to reassure them about the new policy.
Once you mandate at a company level, you provide a lightning rod for discontent.
Qantas isn't the only employer that's forcing its workers to get vaccinated. Earlier this month, SBC was the first Aussie business to announce a no jab, no job policy. And other airlines, including Virgin Australia, are considering doing the same.
I think we're going to see a groundswell of employers mandating COVID vaccination policies.
That could lead to a groundswell in legal action from workers who are still hesitant. Nasim Kadem, ABC News.
China's space agency says its Mars rover has accomplished all of its exploration and detection tasks after 3 months on the surface of the red planet. The 6-wheeled solar-powered rover, which resembles a blue butterfly and with a mass of 240 kilograms, has travelled 889 metres on the surface of Mars. And its scientific payloads have garnered 10 gigabytes of primary data since touchdown. Now, beyond the end of its planned life, the rover will continue to move and carry out additional tasks. Now to what in the world, and some robots are all too human in more ways than one. Boston Dynamics has been showing off its humanoid Atlas robots, completing a parkour course flawlessly. But it's the moments it didn't go quite so flawlessly that have captured the most attention online. And the team behind the display sees the whole thing as a
We learn a lot from that in terms of how to build robots that can survive, falling on their face and getting back up and doing it again.
We all know what that feels like. The team says the 10 years of work to bring the robots to life means it's now able to adapt on the fly and stick the landing. Not all of the time, but most of the time. Our top stories tonight on The World. Australia has announced it will resettle 3,000 Afghan refugees this financial year. The UK will grant 20,000 visas prioritising women, girls and minorities. Hundreds of Australians repatriated from Bali have touched down in Darwin as the island's COVID numbers surge. And the Premier of New South Wales pleads with people to follow stay-at-home orders after another record number of cases. Well, the Taliban says one of its top leaders has returned to Afghanistan for the first time in 10 years. The group says Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar has landed in Kandahar from Qatar. The co-founder of the Taliban was arrested in Pakistan in 2010 and he was released from prison in 2018 at the request of the Trump administration to allow him to participate in peace talks with the Americans. Today in Kabul, the Taliban fronted the media presenting a new image. ABC correspondent Barbara Miller with the story.
The Taliban has learned a thing or two in the past 20 years. Its first news conference since taking Kabul was smooth and savvy, designed to reassure.
I want to assure all those who worked with foreign forces, whether civilian, military or as interpreters, we are granting you all amnesty. We don't want to take revenge.
Ahead of the news conference, a few courageous women called for their rights to be respected. The Taliban says they have nothing to fear.
We will allow women to work, and we are guaranteeing all their rights, within the limits of Islam.
Sharia law can impact every aspect of life, depending on how it's interpreted. During their last rule, the Taliban stopped women working and made them wear the all-enveloping burqa. The key question is whether they'll impose a more moderate form of Islamic rule.
I think we will need to see acts on the ground in terms of promises kept.
This Taliban commander was shown telling doctors and nurses they could continue working regardless of their gender. But in some regions, women are reportedly being told not to go outside without a male escort, and some girls' schools have been closed. After the shocking scenes of desperate Afghans clinging to a US military plane, the US said Kabul airport was back under control.
The Taliban have informed us that they are prepared to provide the safe passage of civilians to the airport, and we intend to hold them to that commitment.
Over 2 decades, the US has invested billions in arming Afghan forces to fight against the Taliban. The irony now is that much of that equipment may fall into the hands of the militants.
Obviously, we don't have a sense that they are going to readily hand it over to us at the airport.
As the number of Taliban fighters on the streets of Kabul increases by the day, Afghans anxiously wait to see if the militants' promises will be backed up with actions. Barbara Miller, ABC News, Washington.
Well, let's return to Britain, where the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has told the House of Commons there is no appetite for a continued military presence in Afghanistan. He's recalled Parliament to discuss the issue, promising to help up to 20,000 refugees. Our Europe correspondent Nick Doles joins us out of London. Nick, and the Prime Minister certainly faced some tough questions this morning.
Good evening, Bev. That's right. And some of the toughest questions were coming from Boris Johnson's own side of politics. They were wanting to know how the UK's intelligence had failed so badly, and they were demanding to know the Prime Minister's plan to prevent Afghanistan returning to the sort of place it was pre-2001. Now, Boris Johnson told the House of Commons that there really was no appetite for the UK or any of its partners to stay in Afghanistan with a military presence. He says even if they wanted to, it wouldn't be possible without the what he said was the might of the United States. He says now the focus needs to be on the humanitarian situation. As we've reported, 20,000 Afghan refugees will be welcomed to the UK. But in the first year, just 5,000 people will be taken in, and that has prompted some heated exchange in the Parliament.
What are the 15,000 meant to do? Hang around and wait until they've been executed?
Yeah, exactly. Here. The 5,000 on whom we're spending 200 million to bring a further 5,000 on top of the, I think it will be a 10,000 altogether that we bring in under the ARAP and other programmes. We will be increasing that number over the coming years to, as I said, to 20,000. But the bulk of the effort of this country will be directed and should be directed, Mr. Speaker, to supporting people in Afghanistan and in the region, Mr. Speaker, in order to prevent a worse humanitarian crisis.
Boris Johnson a short time ago. Nick, there have also been some very emotional speeches from former soldiers.
That's right. Several former soldiers who are now MPs spoke about how angry they are with this situation. There really did seem to be a lot of soul-searching about what this means for Britain and its place in the world, and also its reliance on the United States. One Tory MP, Tom Tugendhat, who fought in Afghanistan, took particular issue with the United States and the words of the President Joe Biden. You'll remember he all but accused the Afghan forces of being cowards in the face of the threat from the Taliban. And this Tory MP, Tom Tugendhat, was most displeased with those comments.
To see their Commander-in-Chief call into question the courage of men I fought with, to claim that they ran, it's shameful. Those who have never fought for the colours they fly should be careful about criticising those who have.
And Nick, of course, Britain, like Australia, like the US, are desperately trying to evacuate people from Afghanistan. How is the UK operation progressing?
Well, things are really gaining pace on that front, Bev. Several flights have already successfully made it out after what was a very slow start. The security situation has certainly improved at the airport in Kabul. The UK says it's now on track to bring about 1,000 people back every day. As we know, Australia has successfully brought 26 people out of Afghanistan, with more flights planned. Boris Johnson and his Foreign Secretary were on summer holidays at the time that Kabul was taken by the Taliban, and the Prime Minister has today denied that the government was caught on the back foot. He says certainly things moved faster than predicted, but he said that the government was prepared. Certainly, though, questions do remain about how the intelligence failed here, why it did fail to adequately predict the speed of the Taliban's advance. And I think many countries, including Australia, are asking the same questions of their own intelligence.
Absolutely, a question that needs to be answered over time. Nick, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, Afghanistan says it won't be sending its 2 Paralympians to Tokyo because of the turmoil in the country. Para-taekwondo athlete Zakia Kudadadi has made a plea to help her get out of Kabul so she can fulfil her dream of becoming the country's first female competitor at a Paralympic Games.
With all the struggles I've been through, I'm currently imprisoned inside the house. I cannot even go outside around this house with confidence and with security to go out to buy just a few things for myself, to train, to check on how anyone else is. My intention is to participate in the Tokyo 2020 Paralympic Games. Please hold my hand and help me, please, I urge you all, from the women around the globe, institutions for the protection of women, from all government organisations, to not let the rights of a female citizen of Afghanistan in the Paralympic movement to be taken away so easily.
Woodside is facing questions from shareholders over its proposed $20 billion merger with BHP. The deal, which still needs to be approved by investors and regulators, would create the largest energy company listed on the ASX. Environmentalists and some shareholders have slammed the plan, saying Woodside is doubling down on fossil fuels. But the WA Premier Mark McGowan is not concerned.
It means that there's a company in Western Australia which is in the top 10 in its field in the world, which is probably a good thing. I suspect it will enhance employment opportunities in Western Australia, so overall it's a good thing.
The Perth-based firm has pledged to cut greenhouse gas pollution to net zero by 2050 and says the merger would not change its existing targets. Well, investing in China has always come with political risks, and the past few months have shown they can be quite extreme. The Chinese government has been cracking down on its tech giants and education companies, wiping more than $1 trillion off their market value, all in the name of consumer protection. Here's David Chow.
Jack Ma was China's richest man until this year. It seemed everything he touched turned to gold. Well, almost everything. But the music stopped when he gave a controversial speech in October 2020, criticising China's banking system for its lack of innovation.
The mystery now surrounding tech tycoon Jack Ma.
Why is this Jack Ma billionaire laying low?
Regulators then slapped his company Alibaba with a record fine of $3.8 billion for breaching anti-monopoly laws. They also torpedoed his plans to list his financial technology company, Ant Group, which was destined to be the biggest share market float in history. Since then, the Chinese government has cracked down on more than 30 tech firms.
Without Jack Ma's speech, I guess the regulators first would not be so infuriated.
Many Chinese tech firms have shares on the US stock market, where it's tougher for Beijing to regulate that money. But they're now being penalised for alleged breaches of competition law, which happened years ago. Some analysts are warning that it's becoming too risky to invest in Chinese companies. The tech giant Tencent was also criticised by state media for its so-called spiritual opium, or video games that were considered too addictive. It's no wonder Chinese tech stocks have suffered an absolute meltdown, and why markets in Shanghai and Hong Kong are doing much worse than everyone else.
From our perspective, it looks like a terrible own goal from China. They wipe out billions of the value of these stocks overnight.
The Chinese government has also been keen to weaken the influence of its tech billionaires and anyone who may potentially become too powerful. After all, these tech firms have gathered a lot of valuable info about China's billion or so citizens, and the leadership does not want that to fall into foreign hands. Another high-profile target, Didi, known as China's version of Uber, defied the government by listing on the New York Stock Exchange. Retribution came swiftly as China suspended Didi's app from the nation's mobile stores, causing its share price to tank.
They've got a longer-term view. They want to make sure that these companies are working not just in the company's interests, not just in the consumer's interests, but in the government's interest, the nation's interest.
China's $130 billion private tutoring sector was also decimated after the government imposed a radical policy banning providers from making a profit. The sudden injection of socialism comes as the government warns the sector has been hijacked by capitalists. It wants to lower living costs to spark a baby boom, to offset the economic impact of China's aging population.
It will actually increase the time the parents need to spend on tutoring their own children. So the parents actually have less free time.
The Chinese government has warned there will be more crackdowns, and the companies at greatest risk are the ones with the most exposure to the masses, where the power and influence of the CEOs rivals that of the ruling party. One key feature of Xi Jinping's policies is that he's not pursuing economic growth at any cost.
I think many people have become complacent about some of these big Chinese stocks. They thought they were too big to touch, too important to the Chinese economy for the Chinese government to meddle with. Well, that's not the case.
And that means no one is too big to fail.
It was ridiculous. Well, the Taliban has made a string of assurances to Afghans and the world that there will be no revenge attacks and that they will work with women, but under the confines of Sharia law. So far, many Western nations are treating the promises with caution, refusing to recognise the legitimacy of the group's return to power. Stan Grant takes a special look at the new Taliban and what they are seeking this time around.
After 20 years of occupation, Afghanistan is back in the hands of the Taliban. How swiftly it came and how easily it happened has surprised almost everyone, including the Taliban. They moved swiftly. From just one city, the rest fell like dominoes, through regional centres and then the bigger cities of Kandahar and Jalalabad. In a matter of days, Taliban militants swept the country until the capital of Kabul and the Afghan army built to protect it melted away. The US and its allies are the latest in a long string of foreigners to try to control the country. All have failed. Now the Taliban are back. Will it be just like before?
Thank you very much, everybody. We've had tremendous success in Afghanistan in the killing of terrorists, but it's time to bring our people back home. If bad things happen, we'll go back. I let the people know we'll go back, and we'll go back so fast, and we'll go back with a force like nobody's ever seen.
The former president was sending a warning to the Taliban. If they were to play a bigger role in Afghanistan's future, it would have to be different this time around. A year and a half after the US struck a deal with the Taliban, they now have more power than many had envisaged. In the infamous Afghanistan papers, it became apparent the US government had known for years that the war had become unwinnable. The US and its allies underestimated how difficult the country would be to control. The terrain is mountainous and arid. It's a mosaic of overlapping ethnic groups. The Taliban are from the Pashtun region, home to the largest ethnic group in the country, followed by the Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks and others. The entire country is now under Taliban control, and the group is thought to be stronger in numbers than at any point since they were ousted in 2001, with up to 85,000 full-time fighters. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s was bloody and brutal. When they withdrew, They left a power vacuum and a civil war. This set the stage for the Taliban's takeover of the country in 1996. Their first regime was ruthless and allowed al-Qaeda to grow in their midst.
We have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers.
Barely weeks after 9/11, the US and its allies invaded Afghanistan. It only took 3 months for the Taliban to lose all their territory. Members sought refuge in Pakistan or hid in Afghanistan.
The history of military conflict in Afghanistan. It's been one of initial success, followed by long years of floundering and ultimate failure. We're not going to repeat that mistake.
But when the US became preoccupied with Iraq in 2003, it split the military focus and its funding. These maps show how much territory the Taliban gained from 2004 to 2009. 10 years after their ousting, they were still a force.
It must be clear that Afghans will have to take responsibility for their security, and that America has no interest in fighting an endless war in Afghanistan.
The US has spent a colossal $2.26 trillion in Afghanistan, $88 billion of which went to training and equipping the Afghan forces. Now they are back in command. Who are the Taliban? And are they the same group as before? Taliban means students in the local Pashto language, a reference to the original 50 members of the group who were students of Mullah Omar, the founder of the Taliban. They were first hailed as saviours. They rid the country of corruption, stamped out lawlessness, and made the roads safe to travel again. But they quickly imposed their own version of Islamic Sharia law, influenced by Pashtun customs. There were public executions, amputations for those found guilty of theft. Men were made to grow beards, women had to wear burqas. They banned television, music and cinema, and disapproved of girls over 10 going to school.
I think of those young people who never went through the Civil War 20 years ago, who have gotten an education, many of them finishing university. They were the future of the country. They are absolutely terrified.
In 2021, the Taliban returns with a leadership structure already in place and poised to govern. They're led by Ami al-Mu'minin, who is the former Chief Justice. There are 3 deputy leaders and then ministries, much like any government overseeing the military, economy, intelligence. Alongside that sits their own legal and judicial system to enforce Sharia law.
Their properties, their lives are safe. There will be no revenge on anyone. We are the servant of the people and of this country.
Despite assurances, there's little to indicate the Taliban will moderate their strict beliefs this time.
We have already seen news reports that many girls have been sent back from university. A lot of them have been asked to get married, at age 15, 12.
Already, posters of women on shops in Kabul are being covered up. The Taliban released extremists from jail. And in the towns and cities they have taken over, there have been reports of punishment or killing for those who won't submit.
I'm getting a bit emotional too, and I feel ashamed that the 21st century I'm coming back asking Taliban to give us our basic human rights.
The policy is that women can have access to education and to work, and of course they will observe the hijab. That's it.
There's very little leverage now that the West and the international community has, so there's not very much that could be done to punish the Taliban if they weren't to live up to their word in this regard.
As quickly as they came in, the US has left Afghanistan.
We did not go to Afghanistan to nation build, and it's the right
and the responsibility of Afghan people alone to decide their future and how they want to run their country.
This season's Japanese Formula One Grand Prix has been cancelled because of the pandemic. Despite what's been described as a successful Olympics held in Tokyo so far, officials have decided against hosting the international racing event in October. F1 organisers say the decision has been taken by the Japanese government to cancel due to ongoing complexities of the virus outbreak. Ahead of the Paralympics, the country is seeing daily cases hit record highs of more than 18,000. And New Zealand's COVID outbreak has thrown the Bledisloe Cup schedule into doubt just 10 days before the third and final test. The match is due to be played at Perth Stadium on August 28, but the WA government now concedes it's unsure whether the game can go ahead. WA has imposed new border restrictions on New Zealand as a result of the COVID outbreak, requiring arrivals from across the Tasman to isolate for 14 days. Several All Black players remain in Auckland on leave, with the team scheduled to fly to Perth on Sunday.
It's a moving situation and we're trying to work out exactly what can be done about that. That'll be very disappointing for rugby fans if we're forced to cancel the game, but that's the nature of the world we're in.
The All Blacks have already retained the Bledisloe Cup with wins in both tests in New Zealand. Now, before we go, our top stories tonight. 3,000 Afghan refugees will be resettled in Australia this financial year as Western nations rush to repatriate their citizens. And that is your world this Wednesday. More world news and interviews can be found at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. Hope to see you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.